He was perhaps the greatest military genius who ever lived. Napoleon Bonaparte won battle after battle, conquered almost all of Europe, and crowned himself emperor. And he still lost, because the one enemy he could never defeat didn't beat him with a bigger army or a better general. It beat him with money. A smaller nation, sitting just across the water, out-borrowed him, out-financed him, and quietly paid every other army in Europe to keep fighting until the emperor finally ran out. This is the story of how a bond market defeated the greatest soldier in history. If that's your kind of history, subscribe. This is War Economics. Start with the problem Britain faced, because it looked hopeless. On land, Napoleon was untouchable. His armies were the finest in the world, and he crushed every opponent who marched against him. Austria, Prussia, Russia, one after another. Britain had a superb navy, but a small army, and no realistic hope of beating Napoleon in a straight fight on the European continent. So Britain made a decision that would decide the entire 23-year war. If it could not defeat Napoleon with its own soldiers, it would defeat him with its money. Britain would become the banker of the war, the paymaster of everyone willing to fight France. And this is where Britain held a secret weapon that Napoleon, for all his genius, simply could not match: the most sophisticated financial system on the planet. Over the previous century, Britain had quietly built something revolutionary. It had the Bank of England. It had a deep, trusted market for government bonds. And above all, it had a reputation earned over decades for always paying its debts, in full and on time. That reputation was worth more than any army, because it meant that when the British government needed to borrow money, investors at home and abroad were willing to lend it, cheaply and in staggering amounts. Britain could reach into the future and pull out cash to spend today, on a scale no other nation could dream of. Hold on to that idea, a nation borrowing against its own future to pay for a war, because Britain did it so aggressively that the numbers still stagger economists today. Because to fund this war, Britain borrowed on a scale never before seen in human history. Its national debt exploded, tripling over the course of the wars, until it reached more than double the size of Britain's entire economy. Think about that. The debt climbed to over 200% of everything the country produced in a year. That is a level of borrowing that would have instantly bankrupted almost any other state on earth, and it was roughly 10 times the debt of France. Yet Britain not only survived it, it thrived, because its financial system was strong enough to carry the weight, and investors never lost faith that they'd be repaid. And it wasn't only borrowing. In 1799, to help fund the war, Prime Minister William Pitt introduced something that had never existed before: the income tax. The world's first modern income tax was invented specifically to defeat Napoleon. By the end of the war, the bulk of British government revenue was coming from these new taxes. Britain had built a machine for turning its wealth into military power, and now it aimed that machine directly at the emperor. Quick pause. This is exactly what this channel is built for: the money machinery underneath the history everyone thinks they know. If that's your thing, subscribing genuinely helps the next one get made. Now, what Britain actually did with all that borrowed money? Because Britain rarely spent that money on its own soldiers. Instead, it spent it on everyone else's. This was the true British strategy, and it was brilliant. Britain used its vast financial resources to pay other nations to field the armies it couldn't. It sent enormous cash subsidies to Austria, to Prussia, to Russia, to Spain, to Portugal, bankrolling their war efforts, paying to arm and feed and maintain hundreds of thousands of foreign soldiers to fight Napoleon on land. The scale was immense. Over the course of the wars, Britain paid out something on the order of £60 million in subsidies to around 30 different allies. Russia alone was paid roughly £1.5 million for every 100,000 men it put into the field against France. The British gold coins that funded all this even earned a nickname: the Cavalry of St. George, after the mounted knight stamped on them. It wasn't cavalry that rode into battle, it was cavalry made of money. And this created a nightmare that Napoleon could never wake up from. He was the greatest general alive, and he could smash any single army sent against him. He beat the Austrians, he beat the Prussians, he beat the Russians. But every single time he shattered one coalition, British money would quietly assemble the next one, defeat Austria, and here comes a new alliance funded by London. Crush that one, and another rises to take its place, paid for with British bonds. Napoleon was trying to win a war against an enemy whose real weapon was a bottomless checkbook, and you cannot kill a checkbook on a battlefield. He faced not one enemy, but an endless series of them, each one refinanced by the same source across the Channel. In total, Britain would fund 7 separate coalitions against France. Napoleon won most of the battles, but Britain kept buying new wars faster than he could win them. So how did Napoleon pay for his side? Almost the opposite way, and it reveals his fatal weakness. France's financial system was crude and distrusted compared to Britain's, so Napoleon couldn't borrow vast sums cheaply the way London could. Instead, he made war pay for war. His armies lived off the lands they conquered, seizing food, supplies, and treasure from defeated nations, and forcing the losers to pay huge cash indemnities. While he was winning and expanding, this worked. Each conquest funded the next. But it was a machine that only ran forward. The moment the conquest slowed, the money slowed with it, and Napoleon had no deep reservoir of credit to fall back on. And here's the detail that should hit home for an American audience. In 1803, desperate to raise cash for the coming war with Britain, Napoleon sold a gigantic chunk of North America to the young United States, the Louisiana Purchase, around 800,000 square miles, for about $15 million. The Emperor of France helped fund his war against Britain by selling off what would become a third of the modern United States. That is the difference in a single stroke. Britain borrowed against its future, while Napoleon was liquidating his. So Napoleon, being a genius, understood exactly what was happening. He knew Britain's strength was its trade and its wealth, that it was, in his sneering phrase, a nation of shopkeepers that lived on commerce. And after his navy was crushed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, ending any hope of invading Britain directly, he turned to a different weapon. If he couldn't beat Britain with soldiers or ships, he would beat it with economics. He would strangle the banker by cutting off its money at the source. This was the Continental System, and it was the largest economic attack in history to that point. Beginning in 1806, Napoleon declared that no country in Europe under his control could trade with Britain. Every port on the continent was to be closed to British goods. His logic was ruthless and, on paper, sound. Britain lived on trade, so if he sealed off the entire European market, British exports would collapse, its factories would fall silent, its economy would crumble, and without its wealth, its coalitions would starve and its resistance would finally break. He would blockade an entire continent to bankrupt one island. Hold on to that, because here is the twist that decided the war. The economic weapon Napoleon aimed at Britain detonated inside his own empire instead. Because the Continental System failed, and worse, it backfired catastrophically. It failed for one simple reason. Britain didn't only trade with Europe. Britain had a global trade empire. When Napoleon slammed Europe's doors shut, British merchants simply redirected their goods to the rest of the world, to the Americas, to Asia, to their colonies. Britain kept right on selling and kept right on earning. And what Europe couldn't get legally, it got illegally. Smuggling of British goods exploded across the continent because people wanted those products and were willing to break Napoleon's rules to get them. So Britain survived. But Europe suffered. Cut off from British manufactured goods and from the global colonial trade Britain controlled, European economies groaned under shortages and rising prices. Napoleon's own allies and subjects grew resentful and restless. The blockade meant to punish Britain was instead punishing everyone Napoleon ruled. And this economic backfire led directly to the two disasters that destroyed him. First, Russia. The Russian economy was being crippled by the loss of trade with Britain, and eventually the Tsar simply refused to keep enforcing the blockade. He broke ranks and reopened trade. Napoleon, enraged that his economic system was collapsing, invaded Russia in 1812 to force it back into line. That invasion became one of the greatest military catastrophes in history, destroying the largest army he ever assembled. Second, Spain. Resistance to Napoleon's economic order and his rule turned into a long, grinding guerrilla war on the Iberian Peninsula, a bleeding wound that Napoleon himself called the Spanish ulcer, draining his troops and his treasure year after year, with British money and a British army fueling the Spanish fight. Both of these empire-breaking disasters flowed, at their root, from the failure of his economic weapon. The blockade didn't bankrupt Britain. It bankrupted Napoleon's grip on Europe. And there's one more piece to this story, because keeping British armies and allies supplied with actual gold across a continent Napoleon was trying to seal off was its own extraordinary financial feat, and it made a legend. As the Duke of Wellington's army fought its way through Spain, it desperately needed hard coin to pay its troops, because no one out there would accept British paper money. The task of getting that gold across enemy territory fell to a young banker in London named Nathan Rothschild. Through a network of his brothers scattered across Europe, Rothschild pulled off a remarkable operation, procuring gold and smuggling it, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth, right past Napoleon's blockade to fund Wellington's campaigns. In the single year of Waterloo, the Rothschilds channeled something like £10 million in subsidies and finance to Britain and its allies. And out of this grew the most famous money legend of the entire era, the story that Nathan Rothschild, using couriers faster than any governments, learned that Wellington had won at Waterloo a full day before London did, and used that secret knowledge to make a killing on the bond market. It's a great story, and historians now believe it's mostly myth. In reality, the Rothschilds had bet heavily on the war lasting much longer. Napoleon's sudden defeat actually disrupted their position, and any quick profit was modest. But the deeper truth the legend points to is real. At the decisive hour of the Napoleonic Wars, the thing that mattered most wasn't a cannon or a cavalry charge. It was who controlled the flow of money. On the 18th of June 1815, at Waterloo, Napoleon was finally permanently defeated and sent into exile. But by then, the outcome had already been written in the ledgers. Napoleon had spent over a decade winning battles and slowly losing the war because his enemy could always afford one more army, and he couldn't. And look at the prize Britain won with all that borrowing. It emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the single dominant power on earth, and the city of London stood as the unrivaled financial capital of the entire world, a position it would hold for the next 100 years. The debt Britain ran up was so vast it would take a full century of steady surpluses to pay it down, right up until, as we saw in the World War I video, another great war finally shattered that debt and passed the financial crown across the Atlantic to New York. But for 100 years, the world's money ran through London. The banker didn't just beat the emperor. The banker inherited the century that followed. That's the pattern this whole channel exists to expose. Every war has a second front made of money, and the Napoleonic Wars are the ultimate proof that you can be the greatest general who ever lived and still lose if the other side simply refuses to run out of cash. If you made it this far, you're exactly who war economics is for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next ledger.